Before I begin my sermon this morning, I want to spend just a couple minutes to say something about the events in Charlottesville, Virginia, on Friday and Saturday. As we all know, on Friday night, white nationalists and members of or sympathetic to the Ku Klux Klan, and the same with neo-Nazis, marched through the streets carrying torches, yelling blood and soil. A 19th century phrase that was assumed by the Nazis as a rallying cry and foundational for the German historic race, being the only one to rightly occupy the country. It was this cry, for example, that prevented Jews from farming in the country in the 1930s and beyond. Using these words Friday night was not an accident, and it was not a coincidence. And then again Saturday, prior to a rally that had been approved by the court, but then suspended by the city officials because they thought it to be quite dangerous, this group and counter-demonstrators clashed. Of course, the pivotal news was that a car driven into the crowd of counter-demonstrators resulted in 19 wounded and a 32-year-old woman dying who was at that moment crossing the street. The driver has since been charged with second-degree murder. As well, to add to the tragedy of the day, 2 officers in a Virginia State Police helicopter responding to events on the ground also lost their lives when their helicopter crashed several miles away. All of us are badly shaken, disgusted, and wounded that such a thing would happen in our country. I think Senator Hatch, the senior senator from Utah, probably put it best when he sent out the message that said the following: "Their tiki torches may be fueled by citronella, but their ideas are fueled by hate and have no place in a civil society. My brother did not give up his life fighting Hitler for Nazi ideas to go unchallenged here at home." None of us, sitting in the pews, or for that matter, standing at the pulpit, can reconcile racialism, a term which includes not just racism, but anti-Semitism and all of those isms that say that people are separated from the rest because of who they are, with what we just heard from Paul's letter to the Romans. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all. But what can we do? What should we do? That, of course, is the question. In a 1957 sermon, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote something known as "Love Your Enemies." And in this sermon, in so many words, he basically cautioned his congregation and all of us who are now reading it these 60 years later of reacting to hate with hate, saying that it can only deepen the despair that we feel and widen the division. Hate never dissipates hate. The only thing that drives hatred from us in circumstances like these is love. Love. I don't know how others are going to put flesh on those bones of Martin Luther King's words. We are all faced with the challenge, however. And so in my case, after thinking about it, I happen to know an African-American woman who is hoping to return to school to be a nurse. And I think in response to what happened on Friday and Saturday, I'm personally just going to give her some money to help her achieve that goal, to go back and start up at Flathead Valley Community College. And maybe someday one of those who simply can't stand a person of her race living and ministering in our community might find himself or herself having his or her life saved in an emergency room with her, assisting physicians inserting the intravenous needle into his or her arm for the critical delivery of fluids. And at that very moment, love will win out. And darkness of hate will be dispelled by the light of the world, the light of Christ working through her. Now, initially, that may not seem global enough or loud enough as a response to what we witnessed yesterday and the day before. But we must remind ourselves always that the vanquishing of the sting of death and the power of sin began with the rolling away of a single stone. We are all called to do likewise. And if you look around, that will be a lot of stones that are rolled away from a tomb of death. Now let me just say something about the gospel that we heard this morning. I'm going to bet a year's salary that none of you have successfully walked on water, or at least have done so unassisted. And in water that's good and deep. Technically, you walked on a film of water while taking your shower this morning. That doesn't count. I'm talking about deep water. Some of you may remember back in the early 1960s, good old Allied Chemical advertised playing on water in, quote, plastic shoes, close quote. The footwear looked like a cross between water skis and snowshoes, and at age 7, I really wanted a pair of those. And I begged my parents to go out and buy me a pair, and they didn't. And one of the reasons why they didn't is I don't think they ever existed, because the articles and the ads that were floating around at that time showed drawings of people walking on water in these wonderful plastic shoes. Today it seems the best we can do is kind of paddleboard around, or as I tried to do as a high school kid, barefoot ski with a girl from next door in the boat, questioning my sanity at that very moment as I skipped like a stone across the water at 36 miles an hour. The truth be told, it was an idiotic idea to attempt it, and my stupidity in trying to barefoot ski undoubtedly helped her to get over me very quickly and very completely. But deep down inside, don't you want to walk on water? Notwithstanding the absolute impossibility of the prospect, at least in our mind's eye, this story of Jesus just captures our imagination. We don't seem to have too much trouble with Jesus accomplishing this challenge. Someone who can turn water into wine is capable of doing most anything, we think, especially if it's the very same person who rose from the dead. And I'm guessing that on a good day, we can even imagine St. Peter taking a hike out on the water, as the story told. In the 9th chapter of the book of Acts, after all, he did raise Tabitha, or Dorcas, as she was also known, from the dead. So he had to have some real spiritual pull, no doubt. I can understand him walking on water. You know, Peter also had this impetuous side to him, and Jesus probably saw some possibility in exploiting that. It is also important to remember that this was Peter's idea, after all. He wanted to do this, having seen Jesus doing the same, and so beckoned by Jesus to come out. Come out, come out. He did it. And it worked until it didn't work, and then it stopped working. So there's 3 quick things that I just want to mention this morning about this story that really strike me as important. And the first is, Peter gave it a shot. I don't know about you, but I think Peter gets too much of a Bronx cheer for what he did. Medieval artwork always shows him just terrified and sinking, desperate for a rescue, and Jesus calmly kind of pulling him into the boat with a look of disgust on his face. And yes, we do remember well that Christ singled out his lack of faith and his doubt. But here's the real kick. Peter actually gave it a try. He saw something that his Lord could do, and he thought, well, if Jesus can do it, I certainly can do it. And this is important. He did this with his Lord inviting him to make the attempt. If it's really you, Jesus, then call me out. And Jesus did. Well, the proof that this was Christ in fact calling him. And that should have been enough. Yet Peter went this extra mile, and he acted on the call by taking the steps. He could have said, well, it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me, I accept you're it. This is precisely what compels us to do what we do day in and day out around here. We're called to always leap out by Christ in one way or another. And here in our neck of the woods, that's exactly what we have been doing for the last century and a quarter. We've been taking these leaps of faith. Of course, the way we do that is to remind ourselves that together we have everything it takes to pull off astounding ministry. And the way it has happened and continues to happen is that all of the gifts given us and all of us relying on one another's strengths, anything becomes possible, especially when we give out of the abundant blessings of God unhindered by the fear of scarcity. Now, it's absolutely true that sometimes mid-project or mid-ministry, it can feel that life is very windy and it is very turbulent. Yet even so, this place seems to have this history of strolling out on the water, ready to engage with doing the work of Christ. And that's what makes it a kick. The second thing I believe is remarkable about this story is that when Peter begins to flounder, Jesus does not let him sink. It would have been understandable, albeit a bit shocking and maybe harsh, had Jesus said, "Wow, you aren't worthy. Your faith is that of the shadow of a pigeon that's died of a starvation," to quote Lincoln, "and you are useless. Goodbye to bad rubbish." But he didn't say that. Instead, he helped him. He helped him into the boat, and with that, Peter lives to minister another day. Most importantly, receiving the keys to the kingdom of heaven and being basically the first to hold human authority in the church. I find it incredibly good news that a guy like Peter, funny old crazy impetuous Peter, got that call. Gives me hope. There's not a person here who has not had a down day when everything we have touched turns to mud and rust. And yet we are never left to sink in the mire, but rather we are always lifted out of the situation, and we are always drawn into a new moment and a new existence. Remarkably, it's often someone else holding out his or her hand and then grasping us by the scruff of the neck and pulling us in. I have found upon reflection that it is very rare, if at all, that I've ever pulled myself out of the mess in which I find myself. It seems to always be another who is there, another member of the body of Christ, even if it is just licking my hand by my dog and his looking at me with those eyes that say, "My God, I need you. I need you so badly. You are essential in my life." And then the third thing I think is wonderful about what we heard today is that the disciples just went cheerfully nuts as Peter was hauled into the boat with their worshiping Jesus. They thanked God, presumably, not just for Peter's safe return, but that they had in their midst someone who could call them into new and exciting places or ministry, or even to a state in which they knew themselves always guaranteed of being rescued were they ever to lose the courage or the faith or the belief. He would be there for them. And as a result, then, Peter is not a failure. He was just one of the band floating with Jesus. He had not been washed out or even sent to the back of the line. Crazy old Peter was simply drawn in and loved. He was loved so much so that the disciples all said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Such an extraordinary story. Imagine God enabling us to do the very ministry of Jesus, even that which seems as fantastic as walking on water. And then, if things don't go according to Hoyle, His grabbing on and drawing us back up on our feet, having us recover from being tipped over by the waves of the world. And those waves, as we all know, can be very turbulent. This is a story most certainly of good news, because when it is all said and done, we are beckoned by our Lord to step out there and to make a difference. Positive, that always there will be those arms to catch us. And nothing can be more reassuring than that. In fact, it is so reassuring that we, like Peter, can say, hey, if Jesus can do it, well then certainly so can we. Amen.